Have we finally reached the end of epoxy tables? Probably not, but I'm actually not turning this one into an epoxy table. This is going to be a glass inlay, and this is a build I've wanted to try for years, but I've always been too intimidated. It seemed really difficult, but as it turns out, it's not that hard, and I'll show you exactly how I did it and how you can replicate this at home. And the first thing I did was make a template using tracing paper, which is an idea I got from my friend Jason over at Wayward Grain, who probably builds the best glass tables that I've seen, and then transferred that onto a piece of 1/4 inch MDF with spray paint and then cut it out with a jigsaw. And the idea here was I was going to use this template to transfer over onto glass. I was going to cut myself, but as it turns out, glass is hard to cut by yourself. Since I didn't appear quite ready to cut the glass myself, I decided to do a little bit more research, become a little bit more knowledgeable before proceeding with the glass cutting. And in the meantime, I'd get started on the table base, which is going to be made entirely of black walnut, the same as the top. So I think the woods together will go really nicely. However, I wanted a design that was fairly timeless, but also kind of unique. And a lot of times those are mutually exclusive. So I came up with this design that my video guy Scott made a nice rendering of. I think it'll look nice. It doesn't have any bars, nothing crosses that clear section. It's just a matter of putting it all together now. And I am constantly blown away by how just a subtle difference with an angle, something other than 90 degrees, can improve the look of a table base. I'm also constantly blown away by how much more difficult it is to build something using angles other than 90 degrees. And this whole table base looks relatively square, but it's full of these uncommon angles. So every glue up was just a little tricky. It wasn't the hardest in the world, but it was just a bit harder than doing it with a perfect 90 degree. And eventually I was able to work it out. This one here was really tricky. I actually have an additional step to make this a little bit stronger later, but finally I figured out the secret to cutting glass. And as it turns out, the secret to cutting glass is have somebody else do it. This is a water jet, and a water jet is used to cut stuff with water and this little blast media infused to give it a little bit of bite. But the cool thing about a water jet is it cuts extremely accurately and also repeatedly. Because this is based on a digital file, if we ever break this glass, we can get an exact copy of it in this color or any other color if we wanted to rotate through the seasons. Now I covered it with some tape, and I'm going to use this to create a negative that I'll then use to transfer that onto the wood table. If you're wondering what I'm doing with all these brass bushings and router bits, I did a little bit of math and some trial and error and came up with the perfect combinations of router bits and bushings so I could get a flawless inlay while still allowing for wood movement. And if you don't know, you don't want to just inlay glass directly into the wood with no gap around the edge, because this wood is going to expand and contract seasonally. So if I left no gap, as it contracted, it'll actually shatter this glass. And even if you don't leave a big enough gap, it'll still do that. And so this combination gave me a perfect 1/16 of an inch gap all the way around, which should be just enough, but also not too much. Now, I've offered a few tools for sale in the past, but the Blacktail Studio Damascus marking knife is my personal favorite. Every time we get a shipment in, they sell out extremely quickly, but we did just get a new shipment in, so they're in stock now if you act quickly. But if you don't know why woodworkers use these marking knives, one, it gives a much sharper line than a pencil, so it's much more accurate. Two, it lasts so much longer than an X-Acto knife, which is usually only good for about one of these, and it gives something for your chisel to write into, and this enables me to get essentially perfect inlays on something like this bow tie here. Some of you out there are probably wondering, what do these bow ties actually do? Do they serve a purpose? And yes, traditionally bow ties and Dutchman joints are designed to hold cracks together. That said, this crack was really small, probably fine on its own, so these are almost entirely aesthetic. I just think they look really cool. At this point in the build, I felt like I was getting pretty close to the finish line, but then I forgot about the routing, and this table only had two ends that needed routing, which wasn't too bad, but the table bases are always misleading on how much routing is going to be required because they have so many edges, and I did put a 1/2 inch round over on all edges except for the pieces that touch the ground. The finishing is the same way. There are so many different surfaces, it made me wish that I was going to spray finish this, but I do love this kind of oil rubbed natural feel finish. This one's really cool though. It cures under a UV light, so you basically wipe it on, wipe it off, and it is dry immediately. And I love having this level of production in my shop. It really, really speeds everything up. The finish I use on the top is the exact same finish I use on the legs. This one is made by Vesting. Again, it's an LED cured hard wax oil, and you can see just how beautiful it is on this walnut. You just wipe it on, wipe it off, or in this case I'm buffing it on, and I'm going to end up wiping it off, hitting it with that UV light. I do 2 coats on this. I'm only going to show you one because the second coat doesn't really look like anything's happening. But if you only do 1 coat, it's just a little bit dry and just not as smooth. And finally, the last step in the finishing is I apply N3 Nano. This is a nano coating that really bumps up the sheen and the protection and the contrast, particularly on walnut. I don't know why this of all woods makes the biggest impact, but it looks remarkable and will really, really improve the endurance of it. I do have one more surprise for you because I anticipated this happening earlier and I was never really sure I liked this greenish hue glass. So when we were at the water jet company, I had them also cut this piece of charcoal glass or tinted glass, and This is the one that I think looks best with the walnut, but let me know what you think, the clear, kind of clear green or the charcoal.